So my name is Rachel Davison Humphries, Director of Outreach at the Bill of Rights Institute. You're here for the Bill of Rights Institute. Our mission as we teach civics, we equip students and teachers to live the ideals of a free and just society, where we more perfectly realize the promise of liberty and equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence. So we really focus on civic education that helps students examine the story of our country and exercise the skills of citizenship. So those are kind of the two parallel tasks that the Bill of Rights Institute takes on. We were just chatting. We do a lot of national programming. We were just at NCSS. So hello to anybody who was there. And I am here with my very dear friend, Dr. Anika Prather. So Nika got her bachelor's from Howard University in elementary education. She then earned several graduate degrees from NYU, and Howard has her master's in liberal arts from St. John's College Great Books program. That's how we know each other. We both went to St. John's. And she has her Ph.D. in English, theater, and literacy education from the University of Maryland at College Park, where her research was focused on building literacy with African-American students through the engagement in the books of the Canon. And she self-published her thesis looking at the lived experience of African-American students reading great book literature called Living in the Constellation of the Canon. That was self-published. Her next book, which came out about 6 months ago, was called The Black Intellectual Tradition. If you are interested in kind of expanding your own understanding of the role of Black thinkers in Western civilization texts, I highly recommend this text. She co-authored it with Dr. Angel Parnham out of, where's Dr. Parnham? Oh, you're on mute.
UVA.
And so she's served as a teacher, supervisor for student teachers, director, head of education. She is currently, and you can find her all over the internet, so follow her on Twitter and LinkedIn. She is currently a sought-after speaker on the topic of the relevancy of classical studies to the Black community. Until recently, so this will be her last semester teaching, she's been teaching English at Howard University, and she currently serves as the director of high-quality curriculum and instruction at Johns Hopkins. She is also, as if she doesn't have enough work that she's doing to support free thinking individuals, she is also the founder of the Living Water School, which is located in Alexandria, Virginia. It's a unique Christian school for independent learners based on the educational philosophies within classical education, married with the very agency-driven, student-directed Sudbury model. So she also, again, with all her free time, got a new building for the school. And because the school is a hybrid environment, she also opened the Living Water Center, where she has book talks and other events and activities, including the very first ever Blacks in Classics Museum, which is open to the public on Saturday and Sunday, with original artwork and inspiration about Blacks who have been inspired by the classics. Her husband, Damon, who I've never met, but I think I would really hang out with, from everything we've interacted with over the years, is an engineer. He's also the financial manager at the school. She has 3 amazing kids, 2 girls and a boy. The boys are growing up way too fast. Your older one.
Well, 2 boys and a girl.
That's what I meant, 2 boys and a girl, but your
Yes.
older boy, he is a little man. And they reside around DC. She's also an artist, a voice artist, drama, storytelling, and just an all-around delightful person I get to hang out with. So Dr. Prather, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here with you, Rachel, as always.
Yeah, so what we're here to talk about is introducing missing voices from primary sources, from Black authors. And how are we doing that? So BRI, a couple of years ago, you were very integral in our development of the resource, Plainest Demands of Justice, Documents for Dialogue in the African-American Experience. You were one of the 3 kind of writing scholars, key scholars, helping us think through how we would do this work. It was actually before your book was published, but it was alongside the research you were doing there, and it really informed kind of how we were thinking about these texts and what texts we were going to include. So Plainest Demands of Justice is 90 different primary sources from Black voices or about the Black experience in America. And it's divided into kind of 3 pillars. So it looks at this, it explores the discussion of race and equality by rooting the conversation in natural rights and the working out of constitutional change. The kind of fundamental question of the resource is, how do we, the people, realize the promise of equality and liberty and justice for all people? So it looks at 3 change pillars throughout the resource: legislators and policymakers, the courts, and then kind of the actions of the individuals, we the people. And then it explores how Americans have worked to realize the founding principles across US history. So it's in 3 parts. There's like a foundational primer that kind of roots everything in the natural rights tradition. Then there's the chronological primary source sets, which are really well done. In Plainest Demands of Justice, we have the kind of complete source set, and then we have the essential source set. And then within each resource, we will, or within a number of the resources, we will have 2 different reading levels. So they're really well scaffolded with I can questions and vocabulary, and they're chunked out for you. So I'll drop the link into the chat and you can go find them. But it examines the concept of race in law and policy. It's modular, so it allows teachers to select and download the pieces that best fit their needs and the timeline, all around this central question. And it ends with a capstone project where students research and present on how their work to ensure a society faithful to the ideals of a Declaration of Independence continues. So, Anika, you were integral to this work, but and this is your career. How we incorporate more Black voices from the canon into the daily work we do with students is, I would go far to say, it's your vocation. It's what you have put your incredible amount of energy to. So in your speaking, in your talks, what can you share about what's most essential when preparing educators to include more Black historical figures?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is there's a question. I didn't say this in the last time we talked. There's a question I always encourage teachers to say when they're preparing a history lesson. Who else is here? Ask that question. Don't let the book tell you, because from the research I've done, a lot of books are not going to tell you everyone who's there. Even in 2022, it's still hard to find a history textbook that tells you the story of everyone who's there in the correct way. So ask yourself, who else is there? So as you're presented, say you're preparing your lesson, it's a really quick thing. All you have to do is just say, who else was there? Sometimes you can say, what Native people were there? What Hispanic people were there? What Black people were there? You can kind of name different nationalities, and it'll give you a sense. I did this once with Columbus. Were there any Black people with Columbus? And there is. Were there any Black people with Lewis and Clark? There was. York helped them navigate their way through westward exploration. He was the slave of one of them, but he was instrumental in them navigating their way through the western parts of America. And so you will find people of color or people not from the Western world who are also in these early stories from the beginning of America, before America began, and on. And so when you ask yourself that question, who else is here, then go on a journey, even if your textbook doesn't have it, to kind of dig out, and it's really not hard to find, and get that narrative. And then just as you're teaching the lesson, even if you're not changing textbooks, and you know that you have this little arsenal of other people present, just mentioning them and giving them your students a little bit of their story opens their minds up so much, creates empathy, creates an awareness that the world is much bigger than themselves. And a lot of times what I'm saying, I'm gonna say this and I'm gonna close this part out, what I'm saying, a lot of times people take what I'm saying and think that's just for Black students, but that's for all students, Yes, Black children need to know that they are a part of the story. But even if you have a predominantly white school, white classroom, they need to know that story too. It changes every child's life to know that the diversity of history.
So one of the things that comes up when introducing these texts, though, is the literacy problem, right?
Yes.
That so often we're like, introduce primary sources, have them read the original sources, have them. And you and I both know from working in very diverse communities and very high need communities that it seems insurmountable. It seems like, I'd love that, but they can't read tweets, let alone, these kind of complex 18th century language. So why is the primary source so essential? And what are some strategies that you have or ways that you think about how, because you started a school, many of your students are very high need, low reading. So what are some strategies and why is this important? Why can't we use the secondary sources?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a nice even mix of students who come from really strong academic backgrounds, and we have students definitely who have some learning challenges, especially if they're coming from that certain neighborhood that we were serving before we moved to Virginia. And they're beautiful children who just needed the opportunity and needed access. This is the thing that grieves. I'm going to answer your question in a minute, but I want to say this. This is what grieves me, is that, and we talked about this a moment ago, Rachel, is a lot of times students struggle, only because no one gave them an opportunity. They weren't given access. And so one of the things I do is I give them access. I have expectations, and my expectations are high for every student, regardless of their reading level. And then I also implement a strategy that I got from Charlotte Mason, who didn't believe in giving the watered down versions of text or the children's version or what have you. Instead, she suggested giving small excerpts, because that's still giving them access to the text. And so I will, depending on where they are, I will give them the text, but let's discuss this quote. Let's discuss this passage. And it kind of has a hierarchy like that, depending on where they are. And then when they're definitely strong in their reading and writing, let's read this whole text together. But everyone gets access to it. And the reason I love this strategy is because typically what happens, even when you give them just a little bit, they're going to want more. As they begin to talk about it, they're going to want to understand more. And I have seen it. They will go home and do research online and come back knowing even more about that little text. And so that is the biggest thing, is access. A lot of young people, especially in underserved populations, predominantly Black neighborhoods, Black and Hispanic, or neighborhoods where there's predominantly people of color, there is an assumption that they can't appreciate this. And so they're not even given the opportunity to enjoy it. They're not even given the opportunity to think critically, the opportunity to expand their worldview. They're not even given that. The expectation is that they won't even go to college. So why bother? And so at our school, we are big on making sure every child that comes in that room is treated like a scholar. I have a teacher who actually calls all the students scholars to them. She doesn't call them students. She says, my scholars. I love that she does that, because we're letting them know, this is what I expect from you. This is what I know you're capable of. I know you weren't given the tools before you came here, but Miss Anika is going to give you these tools, and I'm going to give you these opportunities. I'm going to give you this access. And another reason why I feel so strongly about that is because when I look at the life of Frederick Douglass, my students come from situations where it's not illegal for them to have access. People just have low expectations. But Frederick Douglass could have been killed for trying to have access to this type of knowledge. And even under the threat of losing his life, with no teacher, no tutor, no school, no parent, nobody but himself, he started off reading little bit by little bit until he began to master it. And so I take my cue from the story of those ancestors of mine who did the same thing without the support my students have.
And that access question is really profound, because so
Yes.
often low-level readers are their reading is so focused on, but something that we as social studies people, as people who really deeply respect the texts of history, recognizes that there's something inherently like edifying about reading something from history in its own words.
Yes.
Right. And it doesn't matter the reading levels in some ways. If it's only a sentence, it's only a sentence.
Yes.
I once spent, and you and I have talked about this, I once spent 2 hours on a sentence, right? Because the sentence was that important.
Yes.
And by the end, we all understood that sentence, but it wasn't that we understood it grammatically. We understood it like almost spiritually, right? Like you really understood the meaning of what is liberty, or what is justice, or what is authenticity or responsibility, or any of those kind of essential ideas that are part of the American story.
Yeah. I get students often who have never read the Bill of Rights. Like, they have never read any of the foundational documents to even talk about what they feel about it. And so that process of inviting them to partake of this feast of primary documents, it also builds their self-esteem that you would, I mean, I've seen it when you invite them to read this type of literature, whether it be primary documents or works of the canon, works that they wouldn't typically be exposed to, and they know it's hard literature. To them, it makes them feel, you believe in me enough to let me engage. You're not just interested in me filling in the blanks with a short answer, but you believe that I can read this and have a say in our government, in our history. It does so much to a child. I had a student, and it's in my dissertation, who years ago, and there was a teacher who just somehow, this was not at my school, but a school I worked in years ago, the teacher just had this way of making the students not feel good about themselves. And the student was in my great books class. And he stood up to this teacher and said, you think I'm dumb, but I'm not dumb, because Miss, at the time I was Miss McKinney. Miss McKinney has us reading college level books, and he was just so proud of himself that he had access to this.
And it's that access to these kind of, to the universal truths.
Yes.
That is inspiring. But one of the things that's really powerful about the work you do is you're part of what you help educators understand is that the primary sources exist throughout time from diverse voices. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how your exploration and how you came to that interest and kind of what you found in your research and finding those voices and incorporating them into your curriculum?
Yeah, so I started teaching great books in 2002, I think about 2002, 2003. And at first, it was just an exercise of getting these kids to read these books so that they can, build their reading skill and get into college. And it was like a very kind of a surface level interest. And then I began to realize that they needed to understand that this literature connected to them, that this was not, they weren't just reading white people's books. And they actually felt that I'm reading white people's books. And I was going through this question. I wonder who else read these texts. Was it just like, what is the history behind the canon as it relates to Black people? At the same time, I was asking that question, so random. This is so random, Rachel. I just saw Souls of Black Folk on a shelf at my parents' house. I mean, I wasn't looking for it. I didn't know where to begin to answer this question. And I picked up the book, and it opened up to of the Training of Black Men, and in it was his text about, Shakespeare and Aristotle and how he dances with them and loves to engage with them and how this lifts him above the veil. And that's when I realized there was a history for him to write that. And then I began to look at all the other essays in Souls of Black Folk, and most of them are a defense for classical education in the Black community. A lot of people think Souls of Black Folk is about souls of Black folk. What he's saying is the soul of Black folk can be found in classical learning. That's pretty intense. I've known about Souls of Black Folk, had to read it probably in college, never picked that up. That totally went over my head. But he's saying this is the soul of Black folk. And then each essay is a small passage from a Negro spiritual or a song from Black culture. And that's really important because he starts it off with that song, because that was our first form of literacy, was through song, and putting the stories of the Bible and the stories we've heard around us, our experiences, in song. That's a form of comprehension and literacy. And so all that to say, this is why Du Bois felt that this was so important. This was our soul. This would save our souls, in a sense, was through this type of learning. And so I read that and I recognized, oh my goodness, there's a history here. So he led me to Douglass, which also led me to Booker T. Washington and his antithesis to what Du Bois was saying. And then that led me to Anna Julia Cooper, which led me on this, I call it Indiana Jones-like archaeological journey of uncovering the story of the Black classical tradition. And it's never ending. It seems like every week I'm finding someone else to read about and to talk about to help me understand this. And so I'm just trying to pass that on to our young people, that this reading is not about you reading white people's literature. You're walking in the steps of your ancestors, those who bled and died for your liberation. You are walking in their path. Once students discover that reading this literature is a part of their history and their culture, that it's a part of their heritage, it totally is a game changer. And so I think one of the biggest things when we present primary documents or classical texts is the importance of how we can show historically how this type of learning connects to all of us, because it does connect to all of us.
And that literacy of the history then gives students access to the kind of emotional journey the emotional, the fortitude they need to kind of get through the texts, right?
Yes.
I read this because, Martin Luther King, and I think I learned this from you. You'll probably know the exact number, but like in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, there are 380 references.
Yes.
You have the number in one of your books.
Yes.
To other works of literature in Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And he was doing it without any of his sources, right? Like he was
in a jail. Like sometimes we read it, right? I was guilty of this until I really sat down and thought about it and looked at the story and found out who he was. He was responding to white ministers who were saying he should not be doing these sit-ins and all that stuff. And for some reason, even though it says Letter from a Birmingham Jail, for some reason I envisioned him at his desk with a library of books around it. But when I read, actually, Coretta Scott King in her book, if anyone's listening, please a lot of people don't know about her book, haven't read it. It's called My Life, My Love, My Legacy. It's the autobiography of Coretta Scott King. Someone recorded her telling her whole life story from birth all the way through the death of Martin Luther King, right up until she's almost passed away. And posthumously, she died before it was published. They published the book. They transcribed it and published it. And she described his setting. He was in a jail cell. He didn't know if they were going to lynch him or not. He had no paper, no pencil, no books. He asked a lawyer, I believe it was a lawyer friend, someone who was going to come visit, to smuggle in a paper and pencil for him. So, because I think he had been writing on like newspaper, like scraps that he could find around the jail. But they were able to smuggle more writing materials for him. And from memory, this man writes this really long letter. It's very long. It's a book. This letter from a Birmingham jail that references St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Socrates. I mean, he was all over the place just from his mind. And so can you imagine how liberating that must have been for him, that in the darkness of his jail cell, this is why I have so much hope in this type of learning, he found a light. And that connects to what Frederick Douglass said when he found the Columbian orator. He said, when I had come to a place that I would forever be a slave, these words spoke light to my soul, right? Going back to Du Bois saying, souls of Black folk. It was their way to liberate their mind. And sadly, in 2022, that work is not over yet.
Well, and this is like the other side of the coin of the work that you do, which is showing the voices that were present that have been either glossed over or suppressed now, like post facto, right? Like that at the room where it happened, Black Americans have always been a part of the fabric of our communities. Always. And it's always been present.
Yes.
There are times that, and up until, certain, basically Reconstruction, there were communities that were flourishing, that had whole literatures. I'm thinking about, Kansas and New York and Atlanta and Georgia and, the Carolinas all have these very robust legal institutions, institutions that just aren't talked about when we talk about these periods. So part of the other work is making sure that the authors who do exist are known, which is why you were a scholar on my Impact Challenge, or on Plainest Demands of Justice.
Yes, yes, yes. And I love that curriculum. It's so amazing because let me tell you why that curriculum is amazing for anyone who's listening. There are oftentimes I have seen curriculum that attempts to, and they're probably good to tell the story of Black people's journey to find justice in this inequality in this country. And I think they all do a great job. What I find interesting is you feel like with Plainest Demands of Justice, you're kind of playing like this Sherlock Holmes detective, and you are investigating the story. You're not just sitting back being a passive learner of the story where someone has written up the whole story for you. But the teacher and class are given all of these primary documents to read for themselves with these questions that make them think. And then by the time you're done the journey, you've come to this whole other perspective that you participated in. It is such a beautiful process that you take the students through this curriculum.
And that was the purpose, right? So the curriculum was designed to give all educators access to excerpts. So there are very few full text. There are images, there's song, there's poetry. The vast majority of the documents are primary source texts, though, and so it was designed to be really modular, to be able to be projected into any curriculum that a history teacher or even an English teacher, and there may be English teachers listening, would want to use. But all from kind of, and we were talking about this earlier, but this kind of the tension between those who denied liberty and those who were desiring liberty, right? And so and some of us this past week had the opportunity to really explore that tension, where we were looking at documents with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania that really had this tension in them. Like, we got to page through the William Still journal from the Underground Railroad and see his record of the people that he was liberating, and their old name and their new name and where they were from and who they left behind. And you know, the marginalia where he's like, Harriet brought them, and I was like, Harriet Tubman, and like, that's like right here, like page.
That must have been so amazing.
It was amazing. But then on the other side of the table, and we had about 6 of these tables, where on one end was the desire for liberty and the other end was the denial of liberty. On the other end of the table was the manifest of the largest enslaved person sale in American history, where it was, you know, something like 560 or 630, forgive me, I don't remember the exact number, of people who were, of individuals who were sold 2 years before emancipation, and to pay off the debts of a gambler. And it's just this horrible, but the juxtaposition, and there you're paging through the opposite, where it's a complete dehumanization, where they, you know, they aren't given details, and their worth is identified as that were possible. And it's just pages and pages of that. And recognizing that throughout American history, this tension between desire and denial is part of the journey. It's hard to do with students.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the work? So you've done this at a Howard, which is one kind of environment, but you've also done this with, you know, Christian schools.
Yeah, so I've done it at the University of Maryland. I've done it at Messiah University. I've done it at Black and White.
Very different kinds of I know white Christian schools, predominantly white Christian schools. Very different kinds of environments. So what advice do you have for how to explore this kind of tension within American history, within the documents?
One of the things I do is, you know, going through this process is very personal for me. It's a really emotional journey because of my experiences with racism, also knowing my own family history, the amount of how, you know, all of my great grandparents were enslaved people. My husband is the great grandson of the master's son, and so, or great grandson of the master's son, and he can trace his whole story there because the master's son really made it possible for them to be able to trace their history. All that to say, with all of that behind me, I have to do a lot of work on the inside first as I go in. And the goal for me is that I'm not going to change the story so people feel comfortable, but I also don't want anyone coming away feeling guilty. I don't want anyone coming away feeling ashamed. And one of the ways I do that, first of all, is I say, we're all equal. We're going to all read this text together. You are welcome to disagree with me, ask questions, share your thoughts. No one is allowed to disrespect you. I will never disrespect you, no matter what you say. And that has been really helpful because Black and white students have been able to feel very comfortable to express their thoughts and feelings during that time. That's the other piece. The second piece is that framing the discussion so it's not that it's Blacks against whites, but it's people against racism. And that changes the whole perspective, right? Because when I look at history, I don't just see only Black people fighting against racism. I see Black people dying for racism, fighting against racism, but they were fighting with white people too. And so when I frame the discussion like that, then they know I'm not blaming them for what me and my ancestors have gone through. I am blaming racism. And then I want to show them how people, Black and white, fought against it. When you do that, you're giving young people access to another heritage, another narrative about their family life, that they could be the great-great-grandchildren of Abraham Lincoln, or they could claim the Quakers as their family line. They could claim the conductors of the Underground Railroad. They could claim various white activists who stood alongside Martin Luther King and others. And so once you couch it like that, then it doesn't become something that's scary. It becomes a journey that we're going on to find out who did what and how can I identify and connect to these stories to learn how I should carry myself in the present.
And ultimately, that's what that's one of our goals as history and civic educators, right? Yeah. It's to give this kind of give models of a better future, right?
Yes.
The American project is an optimistic one, that if we are all equal, then there is the opportunity for a freer, more liberatory future for all of us. And that's not always the case, right? So in order to have hope for the future, in order to do anything, we have to be able to imagine the future condition that's better than our current state, right? We have to. Yeah. And by giving all students access to these diverse voices, we give them that model of a freer future. And they can then towards that, no matter what their condition was or is, or which community they come from, they have access to a model of someone who strove for more freedom for people.
Yes.
And so what again, the work that you do in making sure that that so many voices are present, especially Black voices, is really important because, again, so often, anytime you're generalizing people based on the color of their skin, it's racism, right? And so making sure that we're also showcasing the upstanders, as they are currently called, or the diverse viewpoints within any community. That's the other thing that that Plainest Demands of Justice does, is it shows that within the white community there was a lot of diversity around ideas around enslavement, right? You have the Quakers going all the way back, and then you have Garrison, and then you have the ones who were advocating for racism in the 60s, saying it was moral, which is a horrible essay to read, but was part of the political rhetoric of the time. And I think one of the things that I've done a lot, and we talked about a little bit, is the difference between seeing these, making sure that we're accessing these works not only as works of literature and the lived experience, but also as political rhetoric.
Yes, exactly.
Go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I think about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sometimes it gets a lot of flack for the way she creates this character of Tom. But a lot of people have not read it from cover to cover. They've pulled different things out. And I have at Howard, I have my students read Uncle Tom's Cabin, at least parts of it. And then the discussion question they had to be prepared to talk about is, was Uncle Tom an Uncle Tom? And they always come back like mouth open, like, oh my goodness, Dr. Prather, he literally gave his life so the woman could get away to freedom. Like, he's not an Uncle Tom. Why are we saying that? And so all of this, and so and then people are upset with how Harriet Beecher Stowe frames Tom. The assumption is that she framed him almost as if to say, this is how Black people should be. This is a noble person to be this humble slave like Tom, who just accepted slavery as his lot in life and was humble to his master, because he didn't, himself try to escape on his own. But I don't believe that's what she was trying to paint. Number one, there are stories in the book of slaves that run to freedom and stand against freedom. But she masterfully creates this character that the white community, especially the North, she really wanted to reach the North to make them care about this too, would become attached to. So that before that book, people knew that there was a problem, that we had to do something about this slavery thing. And the founding fathers knew we had to do something about it, but no one was brave enough to really just get rid of it, except Abraham Lincoln. But they couldn't arouse the empathy in people enough to really make it happen. So this book with this character that became very endearing to everyone. I mean, people were distraught at the end of that book because she did such a good job of showing what a beautiful character he was. And so that story of Tom in the horrors of slavery made them realize there are other Toms. This is happening to other actual real people. And it brought it home to them. And that uproar surrounding that book is what brought about the Civil War. It was a political strategy. It's kind of like how people dismiss Martin Luther King. I'll ask, this is another thing I do, Rachel. When people come into my classes, I ask them, tell me what Martin Luther King accomplished. No one is ever able to answer that question. And I've had people actually say, oh my God, I don't know. One woman was like, he wanted all of us just to get along. I said, that's not an accomplishment. What did he accomplish? No one could tell. So then we go into learning his political strategy and what he did, how he would, before going to march, he would raise his bond money from the famous actors and actresses of America, right? Sidney Poitier being one of them, and he would raise that money. Harry Belafonte was huge with helping that in that way. He would raise the money, and then they would make a commitment to stand until they were thrown in jail. And people think that was the extent. Then he did this thing where he would find out what political figure who was running for an office would get them closest to justice for the Black community. Then he would send flyers out and get everyone to vote, get everyone to the poll. Like, there was a whole political, people think he just walked across the bridge. They just think he said, I have a dream that I have some people think that he was colorblind. I had someone actually tell me, we got to be like colorblind like Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was not colorblind. You don't know him. You haven't read anything. And I don't mean to go on and on, but this is not just a plague in the white community. This is a plague in the Black community, because Black people will say the time of Martin Luther King is over. Sir, every freedom we have is because of Martin Luther King. He literally politically made it possible for every Jim Crow law that was holding us back to be abolished. That came directly as a result of Martin Luther King's political strategy. And so,
thinking with the author,
yes,
asking the questions behind if you read the text, you don't read the secondary literature, but you read the text itself, it becomes much clearer.
Yes. And that's the problem with our history or civics, because if you read the sections on Martin Luther King, none of them teach that. They only teach I Have a Dream and the bus boycott and Rosa Parks. They don't teach us political strategy. So we are raising a generation of young people who have no respect, no understanding of what Martha King really accomplished.
Generations now. So this is something we talk about is
Yes.
not only are we, so this idea that there is a kind of, when we read primary sources, we have access to some common experience, right? And when we read diverse primary sources that give us access to a common human experience, it binds us together in ways that other work that we do in the classroom can't, right?
Yes.
When I read St. Augustine and I see myself in him as a, white woman in the 21st century, and I go, no, you know what? I do struggle with these things. And when I read Du Bois, and I said, no, I struggle with these things.
Yes.
When I read the petition, like the works of Middle Eastern authors or Native authors, and I say, no, I see my struggles in these.
Yes.
That binds me to all humanity. So when we don't introduce those voices, we're doing a disservice to our students.
Yeah.
But introducing them in a way that binds us together is that much more powerful.
Yeah.
And that's where, again, the Plainest Demands of Justice resource can really support the work all educators are doing in the classroom. If you have any questions, make sure you drop them in the chat right now. We have just a couple of more minutes left, but I really want to tap into Anika's expertise at, again, thinking through what the getting to these conversations. So just to recap, you've talked about needing to do scaffolded introductions, really creating the on-ramp where the beginning of the ramp is really shallow and they're reading just a sentence or two in order to help develop the literacy that's necessary for those works. And then the repetition. So needing to do it consistently to build the skill, to really do the Socratic practice.
Yes.
So that they can build the skills of the kind of dialectic, Socratic process, and then really being careful and cognizant of your text selection. And when introducing these texts, we are making sure that they're ones that edify and uplift all of the participants, that they showcase the diversities within the communities, that it's people against racism, not color.
Yes.
And then the last one that we kind of touched on, and I want to explore just a little bit more, is how the kind of minority student in the classroom can have voice and agency. So when you have very mixed groups, you'll have either you'll have a group of students who are a minority for whatever reason. It may be that their opinion is the minority opinion. It may be that their experience is a minority experience. What have you found with helping to elevate those voices in dialogues about difficult texts?
Can you say that question one more time?
So how do you help elevate the minority voice when you're doing difficult conversations?
Yeah. Well, I hope this comes out right. I try not to think about it in terms of elevating a voice, because I don't want to be guilty of what I've experienced where white voices were elevated. Instead, I want to think about it as I want to elevate the human voice. Sometimes people will ask me, is your school Afrocentric? And I'll say, no, it's human-centric. And as a Christian, it's Christ-centered. But even if you're not a Christian school, it should be human-centric. And what that means is when you're presenting a story, you simply want to make sure the story is being true and that multiple perspectives are all being elevated. When you do it like that, it frees you from becoming imbalanced. A lot of times in an effort, especially after George Floyd's murder, you do see an effort in various school systems and private schools of this effort to elevate the Black voice, the Black story, but it becomes very imbalanced. And I understand why, though, because for centuries, our story has never been told. So it's always been imbalanced. So then we take it on and we want to tip it over to the other side.
There's no model for balance because it was just suppressed for so long.
Yes. And that's been very painful. I was educated in those types of schools, and the textbooks are still very imbalanced against the voices of people of color. Even now, even those who are attempting to fix this are still way off and imbalanced. And so for me, is just being very equitable in how I'm presenting voices, and making sure that whenever I present a point in history, I am equally elevating the voices of all present at that moment in time. That makes sense.
That's incredibly helpful, and unfortunately we are running out of time. It's late over there on the East Coast for Anika, and I know she has the small people to care for. But I do want to just let everyone know that Bill of Rights Institute is here for you. This is our mission. We bring scholars like Anika into our community so that they can support the work you're doing in the classroom every day with students across the country. So we have a ton of resources on our website. I put a couple of links in the chat, but you can go right to the website and just type in Plainest Demands of Justice, and the resource will pop up, all 90 different resources organized into 6 different units, with the essential list and the full list of all the different readings that are in that. They're, like I said, they're scaffolded really nicely and really modular, so you can just drop them into whatever course you're designing. We also are always developing new resources, and our next resource is actually on slavery and the founding, which is a big one that we've had a lot of interest in, and kind of builds on this work. So we had to do this one first, and then we could continue doing the important work of having the important conversations about the denial and desire for liberty in American history. We also, if you do have students who are working on their own agency and voice, I want to make sure you know about the My Impact Challenge, which is our national civics contest. Students can win up to $10,000 for a civics or service learning project. They're supporting adult prizes of up to $600. Over $40,000 total, and those prizes can be a government initiative. So if you're working on Gen Citizen or any of the other kind of organizations, it can be a charitable activity, or it can be a social enterprise. So if you have students who are working on small businesses to support their families or support their communities that also have a service component, they're eligible as well. So go to the website, type in myimpactchallenge.org. You can find that there. BRI is always here for you. My name is Rachel. You can reach out to me, RD Humphries at mybri.org, or go to our website, find us on all of the interwebs. Anika is very much on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, so is the Bill of Rights Institute, Facebook, Instagram. Find us all over the place. And we will be back on Thursday if you want to join us to talk about teaching being an American today. So thank you so much to Anika, and thank you to all of you for joining us on this kind of chilly Tuesday in December. And we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.